P. Ramesh, distinguished members on the stage and in the audience, which include my friends and comrades like Professor Shantasina. I'm thankful to the Executive Council of the Indian History Congress for electing me as the General President this year. I'm deeply honored to be presiding over this august body, the largest and most representative organization of historians in India, which was created during the heyday of the Indian national movement in the mid-1930s. In conformity with the values of the national liberation struggle, symbolized as the idea of India, the Indian History Congress has spearheaded the promotion of scientific, secular, and anti-imperialist history. As all of you are aware, the idea of India is deeply threatened today, and the discipline of history is being mauled beyond recognition and weaponized to destroy the idea of India by religious communal forces which not only did not participate in India's freedom struggle, but indeed collaborated with imperialism. It is perhaps appropriate that on his 60th death anniversary, I should focus my address on what we can learn from Jawaharlal Nehru. The title of my address is Jawaharlal Nehru in our past, present and future. Nehru was among the foremost champions of the idea of India, as well as of a scientific and meaningful history. I believe much can be learned from him to explain our present and chart out the vision of the future. From every speech that you heard today, beginning with that of the Vice Chancellor, you will see presently how much we have actually appropriated from what Jawaharlal Nehru said about history and what one should do with the discipline of history. It is because of what Nehru stood for that he is demonized today, blatantly by communal forces. All kinds of lies, abuse are spread about him using the massive propaganda machinery of the communal forces. Nehru was blamed for all of India's problems. From the partition of the country, the Pakistan problem, the China problem, the crisis in Indian agriculture, the Kashmir issue, crisis in education system, the persistence of poverty, the growing religious polarization in recent years, amending the constitution to curb democracy, name any problem and you find they say Jawaharlal Nehru is responsible. Such is the hatred spread about him that one leader of the current ruling party went to the extent of saying that Nathuram Godse should have aimed his gun at Nehru. Apart from spreading lies about him, the effort is also to erase his memory from the minds of the Indian people. The iconic Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, built on the premises where he lived as the first Prime Minister of India, is no more. It has been replaced by an all Prime Ministers Museum, which is absolutely a first in the world. Nobody's ever heard of all Prime Ministers of all Presidents Museum. And Nehru's role and name is dwarfed in that. The Indian Council of Historical Research, not to be left behind in pushing the current regime's initiatives, recently put up a poster celebrating the 75th year of Indian independence, where the pictures of many freedom fighters were put up, except Jawaharlal Nehru, and in his place, the picture of V.D. Savarkar was added, a person, as you know, who apologized to the British, promising total loyalty. The demonizing of Nehru and the values he stood for could only be done by distorting history, and that is what the communal forces have done. As I am addressing a distinguished gathering of historians, I would like to begin with a brief discussion on Nehru's own attitude to the discipline of history, before moving on to a discussion on how Nehru is wrongly demonized by detailing some of his actual contributions to the making of modern India. I do so as I believe that Nehru from the early 1930s itself provided a framework partly demonstrated in his own historical writings that was in sharp contrast to the colonial and communal framework. Some of the most distinguished scholars of the country, as I mentioned in the beginning, adopted and developed decades later the Nehruvian framework. Even now, I believe, much can be learned from him. While referring to Nehru's outstanding historical works, the three major works very well known, Glimpses of World History, the Autobiography, and the Discovery of India, all written from British jails in the 1930s and between 1930 and 1944, Professor Irfan Habib made a very significant comparison which will surprise many of you. He compared Nehru's writing to Gramsci's iconic prison notebooks. Professor Habib says, these prison works invite comparison in both quantity and quality with the kind of writing that Antonio Gramsci produced as a communist prisoner in fascist Italy. There are true similarities in that both went to history to find answers to the questions raised in their minds as men of action. As Nehru himself said, I'm quoting him, because fate and circumstances placed me in a position to be an actor in the saga of India, my interest in history became not an academic interest in things of the past, but an intense personal interest. One has to go back to history to understand the present and try to understand what the future ought to be. Habib quoted Marx's famous statement, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it, to argue that for a man of action like Nehru, history was not just a directionless descriptive narrative placed in a chronological order, but a resource from which one sought to understand the present in order to try and shape the future. Nehru urged historians to approach history in this manner. For example, just when India was emerging from the Holocaust-like situation caused by communal strife and the partition of the country on that basis, and the newly born Indian state was to embark on the path of building a secular, inclusive country, Nehru tells historians in December 1948 the following. He says, history shows us both the binding process and the disruptive process. Today, a little more obviously. And in any activity that we are indulging in, we have the choice of laying emphasis on the binding and constructive aspects or the other. While exhorting the historians to emphasize the former, in the printed version it is written as latter, please correct it, he warns, true to the rigors of the discipline of history, I'm quoting him, we must not, of course, give way to wishful thinking and emphasize something which we want to emphasize, which has no relation to fact. However, he goes on to say, nevertheless, I think it is possible within the terms of scholarship and precision and truth to emphasize the binding and constructive aspects rather than the other. And I hope the activities of historians will be directed to that end. I'll just take half of 30 seconds to tell you that there are three major errors in the printed version. One, I just now corrected, it is not latter but former on page 4, line 7. On page 13, last para, first line, there is an additional A which has to be removed. And on page 33, second para, line 9, the binary that I talk about is communal versus national, not secular versus national. So please correct those. To return to what I was saying, that is the emphasis to the emphasis on the binding and constructive aspect of history is what Nehru himself did brilliantly in his classic work, The Discovery of India. While the colonial and communal approach was to constantly try to weaponize any conflict in the past to exacerbate them in the present. The colonial communal interpretation, you may note that I use them simultaneously because there is a deep umbilical cord connection between the colonial and the communal. We must remind you of this because the communal now masquerades as the nationalist, but actually they have a deep colonial connection. The colonial communal interpretation repeatedly emphasized the trauma experienced as a result of Hindu-Muslim conflict. These theories, or rather memories, so-called memories of trauma, were often created centuries after the so-called traumatic events. I'll just give you one case in point. The case in point is the alleged trauma felt by Hindus because of the destruction of the Somnath temple by a Muslim invader, the Mahmud of Ghazni. More than 1,000 years ago, in